Yo, shalom, shalom. Waiting on this video to load. How ironic when I try to start my video, man. That the intro is taking its time, but shalom to everybody that's viewing. Shalom. Tonight we're gonna deal with white slavery, but before we get into it, I really want my intro to load. And I'll be rocking, man. Hit that like button.
Jedi, righteous. What you know about the Barbary slave coast? Let's get it, let's get it. Let's get it, let's get it. Let's get it, let's get it. Barbary. Straight from Algiers. Morocco. Pirating with my peers. Barbary. You should have known not to mess with the West African jewelry. Evos. The fascists can't fool me. Your cargo set aflame again. Terror of the Mediterranean. You don't know who terrain you in. Moors. Your people in chains again. Right. The tide gon' change again. And yet we are right again. We are the crosshairs. You are in our crosshairs. If you gon' get caught here, you have to beware. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. Barbary slave coast side. Barbary slave coast. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. Barbary slave coast side. Barbary slave coast. Warriors of the Maghreb. Whipping on your back ribs. For your foul practice. Bodies in the water, no Baptist. Now we got power over all. Remember Hannibal. No matter how big, how tall, even Rome had to fall. That's right. Remember Queen Kahina. Barbary jewelry to sting us. The validity king us. Magi the arena. When we set sail, make the pale people well. Moors bring terror to where you dwell. Come in, take this L. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. Barbary slave coast side. Barbary slave coast. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. Barbary slave coast side. Barbary slave coast. Who I gotta come murk? For some commerce. The open sea be a hearse. It's time to usurp. The British don't wanna see us. Didn't wanna free us. Now we moving white. Like a what? Like a cocaine dealer. Get into these shackles. Get into these boats. Right. Either that or be ghosts. Like Caesar. Sent to Turkey, no hope. That's right. My ancestors feeling me. Living out antiquity. When black people rule the sea. Barbary. No man can fool me. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. Barbary slave coast side. Barbary slave coast. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. Barbary slave coast side. Barbary slave coast. Real pirates of Caribbean, blood of a North African. Hebrews and we trafficking. Hebrews and we trafficking. Real pirates of Caribbean, blood of a North African. Hebrews and we trafficking. Hebrews and we trafficking.
All right. Yeah, I wanted to open up today's show with that. It's a song I did. The song's probably like 4 or 5 years old now. I thought it was apropos for today's topic, which is what we're going to deal with is white slavery. reason why I wanted to deal with this topic is for the simple fact that a lot of people have it misconstrued. The laymen have it misconstrued. Even in some academics circles, they think that when you talk about slavery, servitude beyond someone's volition or will, they think that it's a strictly black thing. Some circles, some thinking groups think that when you discuss people being enslaved or forced into slavery, that one image comes to their mind. And the reason why is because we're in the Western world and we know of the transatlantic slave trade and we know mostly about what occurred here. You had to think about it. Emancipation Proclamation only happened in 1865. That's about 170 years ago. That's still recent. That's pretty fairly recent. So the image that is in our minds, that's ingrained in our minds, that society talks about and reverberates, is the image of black people, or people that have what you call color, I guess. It's not that is that the politically correct way of saying things nowadays, being enslaved. So I want to take out some time on my channel and discuss white slavery, European slavery, something that is rarely talked about. And, on this channel, I try to bring out information and dig up information that you wouldn't normally find. We did that with the origin. Like many people, my political stance, I give the origin of, things, the Republicans and Democrats and stuff of that nature, which a lot of people, laymen, they don't know. They don't know these things. I dug into the DNA and I try to bring that to the forefront. I dug into the Moors and a lot of my old early material and Sephardic Jews. And I just try to bring this stuff to the forefront. It's all mine, spend a few dimes on some sources and books that, to feed your mind. So we here today. Today we're going to deal with yeah, that's true. Yah says Yah is the son of Yahuwah. Says round about the same time as the transatlantic slave trade, there were Africans who enslaved millions of Europeans. I don't know if it was millions, but I'm guessing you're referring to what I made a song about, which was the Barbary Slave Coast, which you had corsairs selling the seas, capturing, doing naval raids, and we're going to touch on that today. But there's more to the story here with white servitude, white enslavement, or people that have lighter pigments that were being enslaved, and we're just going to deal with that. And it's also going to point out the holes in some Israelite think groups and religious sectors in general, because in the Israelite community, Deuteronomy 28 and 68 is a very pivotal scripture for so many groups, so many distinct groups. So that might be the first scripture you heard, in a lot of these Israelite circles. So what they'll do is say, well, only black people fit that. But if you look at it, and this is why I don't have a prophetic argument. I don't like to argue scripture or prophecy with people and use that as definitive fact. If you look at it and examine history, a lot of people fit, being sold on ships, being forced as slaves, and so yada yada yada. So today we're going to deal with. I'm going to bring out two books. The Cambridge World History of Slavery is going to be the main one. And we're going to deal with another book first, just to, touch on European slavery and it already being an institution and why you see it gravitate to America. It's because these people are already used to doing this in Europe. This was a form of business that was already taking place in Europe. And slavery during that time wasn't, 100% African, 100% black. It wasn't. These people, and we're going to get into it, these people were Europeans or Russians or, others, if you will, that were being captured and forced to be slaves in Europe prior to the advent of the New World or the discovery or whatever you want to call it, age of discovery, colonialism in America. They were practicing selling people as slaves. It never had anything to do with, if you were black or not. That's something that gradually became a thing in the Western world. So, we know. Judah the Shooter says, I like your name, brother. That Nature Knows No Color Line is a good book on that. Yes, Nature Knows No Color Line is a good book in general. Ahead of his time, early 20th century work, and he covers so many topics. Damon Williams, of course, the practice itself is named after Eastern Europeans. You are correct. It was named, the word slave comes from the word Slavic, or Slavs, And, really, the word Slav ain't a bad word. I think it means to glory or something like that, to glorify. So, so that institution was already in existence, and it dealt with enslaving what you would call white people. I'm using those terms because it's terms of familiarity. I'm not using it as a term that everybody white is the same. Because if you follow my videos, we know that just because you have a certain phenotype does not mean that you share a common ancestry. A common look does not mean common ancestry. All right, so without no further ado, let's get into the first source. It's going to serve as an introductory piece, and then we're going to get into the main meat and potatoes, the main course here, and touch on this topic and bring it home. So the first source is going to be on my Nook app. If you guys are not familiar with Nook, Nook is, I believe, Barnes and Noble's reading app. So if you get any digital books through Barnes and Noble's, you have to get the Nook app. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. And you guys should be able to see it right here. All right, so this is a book. Get the title of this book if it cooperates. I've read this book before. This is Healing in the Homeland, Haitian Voodoo Tradition by Margaret Mitchell Armand. And this is page 58 of that book. I have a digital copy through Barnes & Noble. Very interesting things inside of this book. The contents will blow your mind. It talks about the Syrians of Haiti, for example, which a lot of people don't know about, the Afranchi people, who they were, being of Jewish descent and stuff of that nature, how Jews were actually being sold as slaves into Haiti. I brought this out before, but I want to, touch on this point here. The European slave industry. The institution of slavery was well rooted in European society. McCormick, 2003, points out that the slave trade was completely enmeshed in the social, agrarian, and institutional aspect of early Europe, and it financed the early growth of its commercial economy by selling Europeans. Y'all see that? By selling Europeans as slaves to the Arab world and African in the market of Spain in the Middle East. So, right out the gate, we can see that Europeans were being sold. And this part of history has really been blanketed because, again, like you look in even some academic circles, they'll say slave proper. A slave proper is a black person. No, a slave, there is no such thing as a slave proper because throughout history, through the annals of history, slaves come in different phenotypes. Slaves come in different skin colors, different races, different cultures. So to try to, pigeonhole one phenotype as a slave is very racist and it's very, curse of Canaan type talk, that we covered on the channel before, that you start hearing talks like that in medieval Christendom, where they start pushing and advocating for the curse of Canaan and black skin being a mark of inferiority and a mark of a slave. which is very ironic, I might add, seeing that all variations of humans come from darker variations. We all come from, like, the Cro Magnons, early Europeans. They were dark. They were dark skinned. And you see these early phenotypes in, like, your Dravidians. Your Dravidians are FM89 lineages. I'm giving y'all a little DNA talk here. FM89 lineages are the basal haplogroups of Proto Europeans, and you see those lineages. You see the skin variation that you see in India. That very well could reflect on what you see with ancient peoples like Cheddarman and um, the early Bretons and so on and so forth, the Cro-Magnons. So to say that black skin is a mark of Canaan, then you're pretty much making all of humanity Canaan, which makes no sense. But the point I wanted to bring out here is Europeans were being sold as slaves. Okay. It says here, furthermore, Darwalk 2003 adds that Western historians have told the story of the transatlantic slave trade as if it has nothing to do with Christianity or the Catholic Church. If the Catholic Church, as the most powerful political, social, economic, and spiritual institution in Europe, did not legitimize the slave trade, this unconscionable trade of humans could not have gone on for centuries. In addition, Anderson Cordova, 1990, notes Europe was used to the culture of slavery, and that institution was already firmly rooted in Spanish society prior to the conquest of the New World. It is therefore not surprising that it was almost immediately incorporated into its emerging society. In a recent study, Thomas found the slave population in Europe, that is, slaves held by Europeans, to be made up of Circassians, Bosnians, Poles, and Russians. So these are European groups, and of course, Russia. These were the slaves in Europe. So I mean, again, what we're learning here is the institution of slavery did not start in the New World. It existed prior to in Europe, and they were selling other Europeans. And this is the importance of education. This is why I am pro literacy and getting our people back into reading and studying. Because if we didn't dig this stuff up, you would not know about it. Let's continue reading. In addition, the Portuguese owned slaves from coastal African societies such as Senegal, the Congo, and Guinea. Furthermore, 6,000 Corsicans were taken as slaves to Algeria. Corsica is an island off the Aegean Sea, right? In the Mediterranean. You had Corsicans being sold as slaves to Algeria. So anybody saying that all you need is the scriptures, Deuteronomy 28:68, anybody that fulfills that scripture and Egypt means bondage, these Corsicans were sold as slaves from Corsica and taken as slaves to Algeria. So does that apply to them? You need more. You know what I'm saying? You need to start triangulating your theories and basing off real data. Let's keep reading. It says the British sold people as slaves to Ireland, while many Irish were deported to Australia and enslaved. So we were reading about the Corsicans. We were reading about the British, the Irish being sold to Australia and enslaved. So according to Thomas, reading on in the material, it says, according to Thomas, European slavery occurred differently in differing religious contexts. For example, Christian law did not permit Jews to have Christians as slaves, although many Jews were slaves with Africans in the Spanish market. Thomas 1997 also asserts that. Before I continue reading that, I want you guys to know how huge that is, because there are people that act as if slavery, like I've said before, is just one way. Africans, that's it. Continental Africans, that was it. No, you had Jews being sold in the Spanish markets. And why is this important and pertinent? Is because the first slaves to come to the New World were coming from the Spanish market, Valencia. And this points to another point in her book about servants being Jews being sold into Haiti and Santo Domingo at the onset in the discovery, quote unquote, age of discovery and colonialism, right? But that's for another topic. It says slavery has never died since the days of antiquity. In the Mediterranean, it had been given a boost by the wars between the Christians and Muslims. Christians customarily made slaves of their Muslim captives, and Muslims did the same with the Christian prisoners, sometimes taking them in North Africa to work on public undertakings, just as Christians employed their Muslim slaves for building. Christian law, as seen in the medieval King Alfonso's Siete Partidas, and Muslim law, as enshrined in the Quran, carefully the place a slave should occupy in society. Regarding religious laws, Thomas argues that the laws of Islam were in some ways more benign in respect of slavery than those of Rome. Slaves were not to be treated as if they were animals. Slaves and freemen were equal from the point of the view of God. The master did not have power of life and death over his slave property. For the Africans enslaved by the Europeans, slavery was much worse. No laws or human consideration took into account their misery, and they were beasts of burden and non-human in the eyes of European powers. Heinrich Clark maintains that Europe took full advantage of wars and conflicts between West African nations and began purchasing the captives and prisoners of wars as slaves. The kind of slavery that the European was about to introduce in West Africa had no relationship to the African system of indentured servitude. So I'm going to stop there. So when we start seeing a large influx of African slaves and being deported to the Americas, as we just read, it was a result of a lot of internal beef and conflicts going on in the west coast of Africa. And they took advantage of it. Same thing happened when they went to the Americas. A lot of the Native American tribes were fighting amongst each other, had internal conflicts and wars and beefs, and they recognized that Europeans took advantage of it and used it to their advantage and got the upper hand. And now here we are today. Since in the European system of slavery, the Africans became the main agent of production and were subject to the exploitation, repression, and control of the plantation system at each moment of their lives. In the case of the so-called New World, in the study of the slave trade, Thomas contends that the conquistadors described the institution of slavery found in the indigenous populations of this region as a form of servitude very different from European society's slave system. He adds, indigenous societies treat slaves as relations, while the Christians treat them as dogs. Indigenous societies treat slaves as relations, while the Christians treat them as dogs. Other historians' accounts of slave systems in African society do not describe anything comparable to the concept of European slavery with its objectification and debasement of human beings. Fage asserts that analysis and criticism of this view are complicated by the problem of deciding what institution or institutions in West African societies corresponded to the European idea of slavery. There's no doubt that the institution of slavery in the Americas and the exclusive transportation of the black race received the support and legitimization of the Catholic Church. As its motto, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, outside the church none is saved, suggests. The enslavement and destruction of indigenous Taino people and the transportation of enslaved African people became the official, immoral, and legal form of abusing and destroying indigenous communities. All right, so I wanted to start off the video with that piece of material. Yellow Lion Amazai says, what book is that? I mentioned in the name of the book. The book is titled Healing in the Homeland, Haitian Voodoo Tradition by Margaret Mitchell Armand. That's the name of the book. Healing in the Homeland. I'm going to type it here in the chat. Haitian voodoo tradition. Um, by Margaret. What is her full name? Let me get you her full name, and then we're gonna move on. Margaret Mitchell Armand. All right, and we're reading page 58. We'll read. All right, so that's the first source that I read from, right here. Boom, you got it. This is the source. So anybody can pick that up. I got it digitally through the Barnes and Nobles Nook app. NOOK. Very telling, very telling. So with that, we're going to go to our next source. Again, I'm bringing this information out, and it's not going to be a long video. It should be short and concise and to the point to show and prove that slavery was not always a quote unquote black thing or African thing. You did have whites being enslaved, as we read earlier. The Circassians, if I'm saying it right, Corsicans were being sold as slaves, and Russians were being sold as slaves in Europe. That was a thing. The Arab slave trade were enslaving white people. If you look at the history of Turkey and their slaves, they had white and black slaves. So slavery is not exclusive to people of a darker hue. That's just false. Okay? So we're going to move on to the next source as well. Now we're going to move to Kindle, and we're going to read from the Cambridge World History of Slavery, Volume 3. And that book covers from 1420 CE in the Common Era to 1804. All right. All right. So everyone should be able to see the Kindle on the screen now. And again, this book is the Cambridge World History of Slavery, Volume 3. And it covers 1420 to 1804. But we're going to be dealing with Chapter 6, which covers white servitude. William G. Clarence Smith and David Altis. All right, let's begin. It says, despite marked geographical and temporal differences across the Western Hemisphere, white servitude remained a distinct and significant phenomenon to the end of the early modern period. The area is defined broadly to include the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And the specific cases of Russia and Eastern Europe are covered in greater detail in other chapters in this volume. White servitude was present to some degree throughout this vast area, but in a highly asymmetrical pattern of distribution. The largest concentrations were found around the Mediterranean, in Russia, and the Middle East. So again, let this be noted. Largest concentration of what? White slaves were found where? In the Mediterranean, in Russia, and the Middle East. Slavery proper was characterized by a lifetime of enforced labor, together with chattel status that was passed on to the descendants. Servitude is defined more widely to include serfdom, penal labor, transportation of destitute minors, and with reservations, indentured labor. Free labor in the modern sense scarcely existed in Christian Europe before the 19th century, and yet the continent's experience was very diverse. Serfdom virtually disappeared from Western Europe, whereas it intensified and expanded in the East. Chattel slavery persisted in southwestern and central Europe, and yet it all but vanished in northwestern Europe. Russia's chattel slaves were all technically transformed into serfs by 1725, but at a time when the latter status was fast sinking to approximate that of slaves, penal servitude was on the increase everywhere in Europe, and a lot of impoverished children and other marginal social groups worsened. Master-servant contracts were normally enforced in terms of the criminal law, and vagrancy laws were draconian, at least on paper. So it's going to touch on this, the penal labor, where they would send Jews to be galley slaves. They would send Moors, um, slaves to be galley slaves, work on the galley ships. And, a galley slave is the people that's on the bottom of the boat that are rowing. Or they would send them on construction projects, as we read earlier in the other book that we started off with. It says the majority of the world's white chattel slaves were held in the Islamic Middle East by the end of the 18th century. This status was unambiguously licit, whereas the Sharia did not permit serfdom, convict labor, or forced labor, even if applied to peaceful infidel subjects. Slavery was thus the most common form of labor coercion, although Muslim rulers regularly flouted the holy law regarding other types, as the formerly abundant supply of mainly Mongoloid Turkic slaves from the steppes contracted sharply from the 14th century. So these Mongoloid Turkic slaves, go back where we at. These Mongoloid Turkic slaves were being sold as slaves in the Arab or Islamic world. It says, as a result of Islamization and state formation, white slaves tended to replace them. There was also a substantial black servile population almost everywhere, together with Indians in Persia, in Turkestan, and few Chinese slaves in East Turkestan. The proportion of blacks probably increased from around 1700 as other supplies contracted. So again, what are we showing? A variegation of slaves in the world. So when people try to, make slavery only black, right? Only black people were enslaved, or only black Africans. That's not true at all. You got to do your Googles. Do your Googles, man. Do your research. Keep reading. It says white servitude was far less common in the Americas, where the black equivalent came to be extremely widespread, and many Amerindians were also pressed into servitude. I've always bring this point up, that the first commodity on Wall Street, Native Indians and Negroes, were being sold together. A lot of people forget about that history because we have a very racial, over-racialized view of history, where when we hear the word slave, we automatically think black. You don't think American Indian, so. But again, that was pervasive in the Americas, so therefore we think that idea of slavery and associating with black people extends and can be retrojected into the past infinitely, which is not true. Let's continue reading the work. It says numbers of convicts, destitute children, and indentured workers remain small, and indentured servants, important in the early years of North European colonialism, cannot unproblematically be included under the label of servitude. Only a handful of white Muslims arrived as chattel slaves in the New World colonies, mainly in the 16th century. Not one of the nearly 9 million slaves freed in America between 1791 and 1888 was known to have been white, though a few were of mixed race. Indigenous peoples of the Americas held white slaves, but in small numbers. As for sub-Saharan Africa, white servitude was even more unusual. The very occasional white woman made it into the harems of powerful African men, such as the Arab girl from Damascus encountered by Ibn Battuta in the 1350s, in a governor's household downstream from Timbuktu. The Portuguese deported a few Jews and convicts to their possessions, and miscegenation affected the slave population of Dutch South Africa. No white person was recorded among the millions freed in sub-Saharan Africa from the 1890s, although some did have Arab, Berber, or European blood in their veins. Grand total of white slaves in the Old World probably exceeded those of African descent in the New World before the late 17th century. This is based on a conservative estimate of 100,000 white slaves for the Islamic Middle East and North Africa in the peak period of the early 17th century, to which can be added an equal number for Russia, where slaves comprised 5 to 15% of the population prior to their conversion into serfs. Thereafter, however, black captivity in the Americas expanded rapidly, with the overall share of the enslaved population reaching slightly more than half of the total North American population, including the Caribbeans. Only Russian serfdom could rival this dramatic increase in black servitude in the Americas. And again, this is why our ideas about what a slave is and equating it to only black people comes from, because over here it was pervasive. That's what we saw. That's what we witnessed. And this is what we see reverberated in movies, films, and popular media, right? But over there in Russia, their serfdom and their Slavs and their slaves rivaled America's. And those were mostly primarily white, and America primarily black. It says here, similarly, the transatlantic traffic in black slaves probably did not consistently surpass levels of white slave imports until the end of the 17th century. I want you guys, are you guys paying attention to what I'm reading? I know when oh, he's reading again. We need to be pro-literate. Like, we have to be pro-literacy. Do y'all understand what I just read? Similarly, the transatlantic traffic in black slaves probably did not consistently surpass levels of white slave imports until the end of the 17th century. Meaning prior to the end of the 17th century, white slavery and white slave traffic was a thing, and it was prevalent. All right. Come to my channel, subscribe to my channel if you really want to be educated. All right. The other channels are about gossip and, they're just in it because they want to be in the limelight. I'm here because I actually care about the material and want to teach and share the information. It says here, the transatlantic slave trade peaked later, was much more concentrated and was better documented. The collection of white captives, by contrast, was dispersed from the Newfoundland banks to Siberia over many centuries, and there was no single method of transporting them to the location of their ultimate use. Records are extremely poor, even if more could perhaps be done with what exists. Potential for growth in the white servitude population fell from around 1700. Rising Western military might curtailed the ability of non-Western populations to obtain Christian captives, even if this persisted on a small scale into the 19th century. Provisions for exchanges of prisoners between Muslims and Christians and between Sunni and Shia Muslims became routine and were better enforced in the 18th century. Europeans finally seized enslaving heretics and came to be more likely to free Muslim slaves who converted to Christianity. East European serfdom was thus the most dynamic element in white servitude, but growth depended on the natural reproductive capacities of the existing servile population. All right, now we're moving on to white servitude in the New World. Few white Muslim slaves were sent to the Americas, for Iberian kings strictly and repeatedly prohibited such exports from 1501. This was partly for immediate security reasons and partly to avoid religious contagion among Amerindians over the longer term. Now, I'm going to touch on that. The reason why it says that is because if you study the history, they wanted Christians coming over here and they wanted the Amerindians to be, or Native Americans to be converted to Christianity, not Islam or, Judaism or any other faction or religion. It says a few white slaves slipped through the net. However, as it proved impossible to prevent settlers from bringing their personal retainers with them, even the Spanish crown sent the occasional Muslim oarsman to work in the Caribbean galleys when hands were in short supply. The Inquisition at times accused such people of attempting to spread Islam in the New World, but references dry up from the mid-17th century. The North European powers never appeared to have imported white Muslim slaves, although they did have recourse to black Muslims. Some white captives were held by indigenous Amerindian groups and peoples of mixed descent in the frontier areas of European expansion. In total, such individuals could not have amounted to more than a few thousand, equivalent perhaps to a few weeks' supply of captives arriving from Africa in its Saint Domingue in the 1780s of Charleston between 1804 and 1807. That said, these cases provide fascinating insight into varieties of slavery. Captures by Amerindians were unevenly distributed. The Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica in the Central Andes was rapid and overwhelming, and the epidemiological consequences of the expansions were devastating, so the Amerindians had little opportunity to capture whites. However, The same was not true for tropical lowlands claimed by Spain and Portugal, where several Amerindian groups held out till independent and beyond, notably in the Amazon basin. Similarly, in the temperate Americas, white settlement proceeded slowly enough for indigenous groups to capture significant numbers of whites. This was also the case in Siberia, a Neo-Europe similar to the temperate Americas. Captives were typically taken in wars or raised and were most likely to be women and children, as men were usually killed on capture. As explained in series introduction, the aim of this captivity was not primarily the extraction of labor, but rather the expansion of maintenance of the captors group through assimilation. Under threat from both disease and territorial incursions, some groups relied heavily on captives to maintain their numbers. The captives might be so numerous that the identity of the whole society altered fundamentally, as for example in the case of the Iroquois and the Comanches. Their way of life came to occupy middle ground between the original cultures and those of multifarious captives, including a few whites. Those of European descent who managed to flee spawned the genre of captive narratives. These were primarily written by women, given the sex ratio of permanent captives, and most autobiographical accounts were authored by short-term captives. Much less common is the first-hand information from those who assimilated, such as Mary Jemison, who lived for 78 years among the Senecas. Many, like Jemison, chose to remain with their captors. Others, taken as children, would have lived and died without further contact with European society. Widening the focus of other forms of white servitude, various chapters in this volume demonstrate that peoples of all colors were subjected to multiple forms of bondage in the early modern Atlantic, among them convicts. Transportation was never seen primarily as a way of supplying labor. However, for its main function was to rid the mother country of undesirables, whether because of criminal behavior or political and religious dissent. Some slave vessels saw service as convict ships, but the number of prisoners carried across the Atlantic was tiny in comparison with African slaves. The labor performed subsequent to exile was no more than a way of fortuitously reducing the cost of the ocean voyage for governments. Whether incurred directly or by paying merchants to undertake the task, the temporal profile of European penal servitude in exile was similar to that of the rise and decline of the transatlantic slave trade, except that it began, peaked, and ended about 80 years later than the slave trade. Some blacks were caught up in the system in the 17th century and again in the early 19th century, but victims were overwhelmingly white. Iberian empires were quick to use convicts. White galley oarsmen, probably mainly convicts, were employed in the Havana harbor in the mid-16th century. Their successors built and maintained the impressive fortifications in the same location down to at least the late 18th century. The Portuguese sent convicted felons to exile in their overseas possessions from the early 17th down to the mid-19th century. These degradados were employed in public works wherever the Portuguese established imperial outposts and might have been paid something for their service. By the early 19th century, the Portuguese were sending out southern Italian convicts to their colonies, and some of whom prospered and became famous, such as the Nassolini family in Guinea and the Albacini family in Mozambique. The Iberians usually held deportees under state control for employment in public works. They often rented them out to companies and private individuals. North European nations, with the striking exception of the Dutch, entered the business of exporting convicts from the early 17th century, selling the labor services of convicts to the highest bidder in the New World. For the English, transportation began as a publicly subsidized but privately operated institution, with convicts sold on the open market as an indentured service at the end of their journey. These flows were supplemented from time to time with batches of people taken prisoner in civil wars or during the conquest of Ireland. Transportation became publicly funded after the switch from the Chesapeake to Australia in the aftermath of the U.S. independence, but only because of the greater distance and cost of getting to the antipodes and the initial lack of any market for convicts in the early years of Australian settlement. The French were relatively slow in adopting penal exile, but long maintained it in Guyana. They also directed part of the flow to their Pacific colony of the New Caledonia in the 19th century. The Russians sent convicts to Siberia from the late 16th century. The gulags of the Soviet Union, in many ways, a continuation of the old Russian system, will be taken up in the subsequent volume. Servitude of this type was less constraining than slavery proper and was not hereditary. If any convicts escaped and returned home, they were liable to capital punishment, but their loss of freedom in the New World was usually temporary. Although those convicted of serious crimes served for life, the vast majority of the detainees were sentenced to limited terms. They were not subject to the laws of slavery, and almost every early modern community in the Americas enacted. Prisoners may have been unfree, exiled, and subject to abuse, but their offspring were not the property of the person who had paid for their labor. In short, they were not chattels, and those who had served their term could find employment as free workers. When royalist prisoners set to work in Barbados during the 1650s claimed that to sell and enslave these of their own country and religion was a thing not known amongst the cruel Turks, they were wrong, both about the Turks and in equating their situation with chattel slavery. The same was true of destitute minors exported to reduce the cost of child support to the community of sometimes as undesirables. For such child migrants, bondage normally lasted only into early adulthood. Children of conversos, converted Jews, were sent by the Holy Office and Inquisition to Sao Tome in the Gulf of Guinea, mostly to meet an early death. If they survived, they were usually freed as adults, were not subject to slave codes, did not pass on their status as coerced workers to their descendants. The English planned to dispatch penniless children from London to North America under the auspices of the Virginia Company in the early 17th century. Children dependent on the charity loan remain as at risk of forced immigration, with Dr. Barnardo's home for orphans sending thousands of children to Canada as late as the mid-20th century. Whether indentured servants should be placed in the category of servitude is a moot point. They were subject to sale without their consent. Physical chastisement and restrictions on their personal liberty during their period of servitude. Contracts were sanctioned and enforced under the criminal rather than civil law. In many cases, of kidnapping of young people emerged. However, as explained elsewhere in this volume, contracts rested on a market transaction in which future labor sources were pledged in return for passage across the Atlantic. For the most part, the relationship was voluntarily entered into by the laborer and contract holder. In origin, it emerged as an extension to annual agreement that were the norm in parts of the metropolitan economy, and the arrangement was overseen by the courts on both sides of the Atlantic. Moreover, the terms of servitude was limited, normally for 3 years in the French colonies and 4 in the English, with skill levels and age playing major roles in the setting particular conditions. Plantation slaves would willingly have switched status when indentured servants had the opportunity presented itself. Indentured servants greatly outnumbered convicts in the English, Dutch, and French Americas, even though overall numbers of both amounted to less than 5% of transported slaves. Servants formed the basis of the early plantation economy and were an important part of the colonial labor force, even in the early stages of the Sugar Revolution. When black slaves came to dominate the field labor force, indentured servants remained a major source of skilled labor for plantations well into the 18th century, when enslaved peoples of African descent looked over this function too. A market for indentured servants, both skilled and unskilled, continued into the 19th century in the mainland North America. All right, so we covered colonial America and how white slaves were being transported into Americas, how much the percentile was, like less than 5% in their roles, and how did they, through penal or convict labors, meaning they got convicted of some crime or the kidnapping of children. So we covered that. Now let's cover white servitude in Christian Europe. It reads, by the early 16th century, serfdom had largely disappeared from Western Europe, even as it intensified in Eastern Europe, and especially in Russia. There remain isolated cases of serfdom in minor regions of Scotland and Germany, but the institution eroded gradually, even in southwestern Europe. It was formally abolished at the very end of the period, as part of the great social upheavals resulting from the French Revolution. In contrast, penal servitude expanded steadily through the period in most European countries, although it was never large in comparison to slavery in the New World. Rather than being motivated by a desire for coerced labor, this former part of process of penal reform, new offenses were defined, and punishments for old offenses were changed from public shaming, corporal punishment, and execution to working for a term of labor, often in exile in the colonies, as noted earlier. Conviction meant social death and that the state appropriated the convict's property. He or she had no subsequent standing in law, and the term of service was for life. The French accepted criminals from other European polities, especially German principalities and East European states, so that the gangs of chained men periodically traversed Europe from the mid-16th century to the mid-18th century. Penal servitude was particularly significant in supplying manpower to the galleys of national navies, a notoriously dangerous and unpleasant occupation. Although the Dutch distinguished themselves by eschewing this option, the Restoration government in England owned and operated galleys powered by captive oarsmen and serviced by captive dockyard labor. Nevertheless, the largest employers of such labor were in southwestern Europe. Louis XIV brought the French galley fleet to its acme, with some 12,000 oarsmen and 42 vessels operating out of the Atlantic and Mediterranean ports. Although this costly, anachronistic effort scarcely strengthened France's naval power, other significant players were Spain, the Italian states, and Malta. And we dealt with Malta on the show before about the Jews being sold as slaves from Malta. It says criminals were not only oarsmen. Huguenots were sent to the galleys after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, with Jane Martelli writing the most widely read personal account of the system. Catholic prisoners of war might occasionally be pressed into service, as with Spaniards serving on French vessels. There were also scattering of free oarsmen, in fact, depions. These mainly Italian Bonavogili, excuse me if I butchered that, were quite numerous in French galleys in the 16th century, but had virtually disappeared by the dawn of the 17th century, although they persisted longer in Italy itself. Security risks and fluctuating supplies of Muslim slaves led to a greater emphasis on convicts in the early modern era, but white slaves continued to be employed, as noted later, and black slaves were at times imported. Galleys thus carried ethnically and religiously heterogeneous crews with wildly different legal statuses that were indicated by their varied hairstyles or instant recognition. So again, speaking to the topic, and I'm going to continue reading after this quick brief comment. Speaking to the topic, you can't just put one color or race on servitude or slavery. You got to do your Googles, you got to do your research, as we're reading here. These galleys, these people that were forced to do convict labor, a lot of these people were European. You know, some of them were Jews, some of them were Moors, and you did have some Africans, but a lot of these people were Europeans, white Europeans, being forced to do this labor, coerced labor. It says there was no equality under adversity, for the most strenuous tasks were reserved for slaves. The convict did not become a slave, could not be resold, and did not transfer his status to his children. He could be replaced on the galleys by a slave purchased by his family, although the French refused to extend this privilege to Huguenots. White convicts no longer able to row were sent to the Caribbean as indentured laborers, with their contracts sold for what they could fetch. As galleys declined in the 18th century, the French also turned to imprisoning or executing more criminals. As for worn out or supernumerary slaves, they were normally sold as chattels in Mediterranean markets, or if African, more probably in the Caribbean. The French freed 7 white galley slaves and sent them to the Caribbean in 1685 to 89, but did not repeat the experiment. Chattel slavery became effectively extinct in Anglican and Calvinist northwestern Europe. Despite the presence of a handful of black and Asian slaves brought back from the colonies, such slaves landed in Dutch ports were liable to be liberated in the late 16th century. The 1569 Cartwright decision held that flogging a slave, a Russian, cannot be justified. In the famous Somerset case of 1772, Chief Justice Mansfield stated that any slaves, by the act of walking on English soil, became free, though the courts did not prevent the slave Grace returning to Antigua as a slave in 1827. Moreover, there were no signs of white slavery in England or Netherlands in 1604. In 1604, the Dutch repatriated the 1,400 Muslim oarsmen whom they found on a captured Spanish fleet, though these unlucky men were re-enslaved while crossing France. That said, the Dutch were not averse to executing Muslim captives. Admiral Lambert threatened to hang his prisoners in 1624 if the Algerians did not release Dutch slaves held in Algiers. Not only did he carry out his threat, but he then seized more Algerians and hanged them as well, perhaps contributing through his ruthlessness to the signing of an accord 2 years later. Further east in the Lutheran Europe, white slavery did persist, at least in the German-speaking lands. Great droves reached Hanover in 1683, following successful campaigns in Morea, in Hungary, and Balkan. Wars remained the chief source of supply of German states. The best records come from lists of Muslims accepting baptism, but one observer noted that the majority refused to renounce their faith. No overall estimates exist, but thousands were recorded, including in places such as Leipzig. Muslim slavery persisted late into the 18th century, albeit a small scale. Chattel slavery was more developed in Catholic southwestern Europe, where there had been marked late medieval resurgence in the exploitation of slave labor. Following the Black Death, France is included in the designation, although no country was more divided over the issue. There was a long tradition that French soil conferred freedom to all those who stepped upon it, and some black slaves arriving in France in the late 16th century were set free. A royal declaration of 1571 reaffirmed that the soul of France granted liberation, though this was prudently glossed in 1607 as applying only to those who had accepted baptism. Special legislation had to be passed to allow Caribbean slave owners to visit with their personal slaves without risking the loss of their human property. Black slavery was initially significant in the southwestern Europe, but it coexisted with an older white slavery. I hope you guys are taking notes. Black slavery was initially significant in southwestern Europe, but it coexisted with an older white slavery, which soon became predominant again. Blacks coming both via the Atlantic and across the Sahara were particularly common in Sicily, southern Iberia, the Canaries, Madeira, working in domestic service, proto-industrial units, mines, and agriculture. Philip Curtin considers that imports of black slaves into Europe fell sharply at the end of the 16th century, and this seems to fit the Sicilian case. However, Alexandro Stella suggests that blacks remained numerous in southern Iberia till around the 1640s. Adult males were occasionally shipped in from the tropics for galley work, but they were expensive and suffered from excessive mortality and morbidity. A trickle of non-white slaves, mostly children, continued to arrive in Cadiz and Lisbon from Africa, Asia, and the Americas down to the mid-18th century. In 1761, however, a Portuguese law forbade any further imports on the grounds that the colonies were desperately in need of labor. And in 1773, all born to a slave mother were thereafter to be free. Most black slaves in the Mediterranean were thus acclimatized Muslims, captured in a free or servile condition, although recently enslaved animists were also occasionally seized from Muslim owners. Among southwestern Europe's white slaves were some Jews and heretical Christians who were nevertheless called Turks. When practicing Jews fled from Iberia to Muslim countries in the 1490s, they became allies to the enemies of the faith. Whether captured or purchased, they were thus kept as slaves, with a particularly significant group of them in Malta, which we covered in prior episodes about Jews being sold in Malta and some Jews trying to ransom them. We covered that. A great source for that is the Medieval Jews of Europe. a source book by, I believe, Rader. It says also enslaved were Orthodox Christians from the Eastern Mediterranean, especially Greeks, whom the Italians called half Turks when they worked directly for the Ottomans. Milo, probably the Greek island of Milos in the Cyclades, was the main mark for purchasing such people in the 1680s. Russian and Ukrainian Orthodox Christians taken as slaves from the Ottoman galleys had to perform the same service on Catholic ones. To be sure, Colbert instructed the French consul in Genoa in 1677 to abstain from buying the Turk Cheritons, but the latter ignored these instructions due to the pressing need for oarsmen. Indeed, such was the demand of galley labor that the occasional Catholic was to be found among the Turks. Many were Poles originally enslaved by the Crimean Tatars or Croats and Hungarians. Although two 14th century popes had asserted that the Catholic rebels against the papal authority could be enslaved, such strictures did not apply to these people, who were usually freed on proving their religious status. The Spanish crown strictly forbade the purchase of any Catholic in 1628, but there were still some in Italy in 1680s. As for the Catholics who had adopted Islam, they generally kept very quiet, fearing the harsh penalties meted out by the Inquisition to the renegades. Moreover, although social conventions held that the baptism of Muslims should entail liberation, this was not enshrined in law, was often not observed. The great bulk of slaves in southwestern Europe by the mid-17th century consisted of white Muslims, whether captured or bought. Purchases occurred chiefly in the Eastern Mediterranean, even though the Ottomans, in the theory, did not permit traders of any faith to sell Muslim slaves to the infidel. Some ulama fulminated against sales of Muslims in North Africa. Although these seem to have been unusual, captures in the Eastern Mediterranean were limited by treaties and considerable power of the Ottoman navy, and thus tended to occur in large bursts during major breakdowns in the balance of power. In the Western Mediterranean, capture, whether at sea or on land, was on a smaller scale, but more constant, resulting more from regular corsair raiding than from sustained campaigns. When treaties became inconvenient, Christian privateers switched between flags of convenience. Ports in Italy, Malta, and Croatia specialized in preying on Muslim ships and shores, with the natives of two crusading Catholic orders to the fore. The Knights Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem, expelled from Rhodes by the Ottomans in 1522, took refuge in Malta and sought their revenge. The Knights of St. Stephen were founded in the Medici rulers of Tuscany and approved by the Pope in 1562. They had their headquarters in Pisa and a naval base in Livorno. Their registers show 10,115 slaves captured between 1568 and 1688. Now, reading you all this because, again, this touches on white slavery, right? Let me continue to read. It says here, but their Iberian reformers abandoned their ancient dreams of reconquering North Africa and sought instead to establish stable and peaceful treaty relations with Morocco and the Barbary states. Neither French, excuse me. Oh, wait a minute. I skipped something right here. We're here. But their ledgers are incomplete, and the real figure was probably 15,000 or even 20,000, as a new Tuscan dynasty curbed the exploits of the Knights of the St. Stephen. From 1737, the Papal and Neapolitan navies stepped into the breach. Other Italian raiding centers were Sicily, Sardinia, and Genoa. As for the fearsome Usoci, privateers of Croatia, they had their chief lair in Segna on the Dalmatian coast. Farther west, the Iberians were other great fishers of men, initially within their own borders. The fall of Malaga in 1487 yielded some 10,000 slaves, and the revolt of Grenadier Moriscos in 1569 led to the captivity for thousands more. In the confusion surrounding the 1610 expulsion of Spain's Moriscos, yet more were enslaved. The Iberians also conducted frequent raids from their forts scattered along North African coast, with the Spaniards taking several thousand slaves when they seized Tripoli in Libya. In 1510, Forays by sea were equally significant, with the corsairs of the Balearics enjoying a particularly fearsome reputation. Assaults generally declined in the 18th century, however, following the event of the Bourbon dynasty in Spain in 1700 and the rise of the Marquis of Pombal in Portugal from 1750. The Iberian reformers abandoned the ancient dream of reconquering North Africa and sought instead to establish stable and peaceful treaty relations with Morocco and the Barbary states. Neither France nor Venice captured many Muslim slaves in any century, reflecting a tradition of alliance with the Ottoman Empire. Indeed, Venice was well known for holding fewer Muslim slaves than other Italian states, and for freeing them if the Sublime Porte demanded it. France not only played off the Ottomans against the Habsburgs, but was also precocious in signing treaties with the Barbary states. The French possessed many Muslim slaves, but were heavily reliant on purchases from foreign suppliers, especially in Genoa, Livorno, Malta, and even in the Eastern Mediterranean. The French preferred to obtain Bosnian Muslims whenever possible, as they held Balkan people to be the best slaves. Land battles in southeastern Europe yielded yet more Muslim slaves as the Habsburgs first stopped and then reversed the Ottoman advance in the Balkans from around 1500. Capitals became even more plentiful in Austria, Hungary, and Croatia. Some were sold across the Adriatic into Italy or north into the Catholic and Lutheran parts of Germany, but many were held in Austrian heartlands. Now, with this part right here, these are stone cold Europeans. For the viewing audience, I see we have a few people in the building. Do these people fit Deuteronomy 28:68? Since we only use scripture, we only use the Bible, we don't use any outside sources, external sources, as many people claim. These people were captured, sold as slaves, sent to another land. Do they fit that narrative? You have to really, this is why on this channel, I always tell you, like, we have to learn how to triangulate information. We have to be able to provide sources upon sources to create more concrete theories instead of, saying, oh, well, okay, well, these people fit it too. Does this mean they're Israelites? Just keep that in your mind. But these people are stone cold Europeans. A lot of these people are whites. Speaking to the topic, white slavery. I'm going to continue to read. It says, similarly, the Russians captured numerous Muslim slaves as they reversed the earlier pattern of the Tatar domination, seizing the Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Sibir in quick succession in the 16th century. While a military stalemate followed, communities of battle-hardened Cossacks regularly seized Muslims all along the lengthy frontier. 1725 Russian assimilation of slavery into serfdom meant little in these rough settlements, and Cossacks continued to take de facto Muslim slaves well into the 19th century. Total numbers are not known, but Salvatore Bono's thorough trial through the patchy evidence leads him to an estimate for 4 to 500,000, and in Italy alone for 1,500 to 1,800, suffering with high mortality rates. He also advances as much as a lower figure of 90 to 120,000 raided slaves for the 16th and 17th centuries, excluding shipwrecked and purchased individuals. Among Italian cities, Naples probably had the largest number of Muslim slaves, with up to 20,000 around 1600 and 10 to 12,000 in 1661. Overall, Bono tentatively suggests that Muslim slaves in early modern Christendom may well have been as numerous as Christian slaves in Islam. Although much more work is necessary to test this hypothesis, especially in Spanish and Maltese archives. The state took a pick of captives and employed them mainly in the galleys and related maritime tasks in southwestern Europe, despite the increase of the proportion of convicts noted. The Spaniards used numerous servile Muslim oarsmen in attempting to repress the Dutch independence struggle in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. It still has some galleys in service in 1751. The theoretical French ratio was 1 slave to 3 convicts in the 1680s, though the actual number of slaves might have been higher. Although sail gradually replaced oars in the 18th century, France continued to buy slaves for the galleys till 1748. In Italy, the ratio of slaves of the oarsmen was often closer to 1 to 2. And galleys survived longest in Italy and Malta, which lacked an Atlantic coast. State-owned slaves also labored in a variety of public works under appalling conditions. Especially notorious was the plight of Muslim slaves in Almaden's poisonous mercury mines, which reverted to the Spanish crown in 1645 and which service was equivalent to the death sentence. The quarries of southern Italy employed many other unfortunate as late as 1754, and the construction of the extravagant buildings and new roads was prominent. Perilous work in hospitals were often assigned to Muslim slaves who were made to collect and bury bodies when the plague decimated Marseilles in 1720. As late as 1812, the authorities kept 86 slaves in Cagliari, employed for no pay in the most unpleasant public works, and simultaneously held to bargain for possible exchange with Sardinians enslaved in North Africa. Sardinians enslaved in North Africa. Much less is known about the slaves of private masters who seem to have shrunk as a proportion of the total in the course of the 17th century. They generally enjoyed their better condition than the state slaves had higher chance of liberation on conversion, especially if they acted in domestic capacity. The numerous slaves of Rome's cardinals and religious officials were sometimes something of an elite, but there were also many employed in more humble artisanal agricultural tasks. A 1581 document concerning 575 Morisco slaves in Malaga showed that about 2/3 of them engaged in directly productive labor, mainly in agriculture. Officials sometimes commended private slaves, as in Sicily in 1642, but more often purchased them when necessary. Muslim slaves of private owners were mentioned as far afield as Brittany in 17th century France. In the last known French reference dates from 1695, when a Muslim slave escaped from his master. In Iberia, private servitude persisted longer. A Portuguese royal decree of 1773 declared that the children of white, mestiza, and black slave women by free men were all henceforth to be born free, but their mothers will remain enslaved for their lifetime. As for Italy, a Palermo court in Sicily decided in 1812 that a Moorish male fugitive slave should be returned to his princely master, and that baptism did not legally entail freedom. Unfortunately, there are a few accounts of Muslims and their experience of slavery in Italy. Letters from Muslim slaves to the authorities have been preserved, and their most common requests were to have their own prayers, houses, and cemeteries. This was often allowed in Italy, but was prohibited in Spain, where the Inquisition discovered a clandestine mosque in Cartagena in 1769. A Muslim slave building arose in 1767 in the Guadarrama region near Madrid wrote of the Sultan of Morocco that he and his fellows worked without rest or relief, were constantly beaten, and received poor food and clothing. The scarcity of such materials may reflect low levels of literacy in the small numbers who escaped or were ransomed, but it is also the case of the scholars with a command of Arabic and Ottoman Turkish have yet to turn their full attention to the sources that do exist. Resistance mainly took the form of individual sabotage, murder, and flight, but sometimes entailed cooperative actions. Shipboard revolts were particularly feared by Christian captains, and with good reason, for the exploiters of slaves quite often found themselves taken into slavery by their arch-wild victims. There was only one known major rebellion on land at Malta in 1749, when the number of slaves on the island was estimated of 9,000. The Knights brutally put down this rebellion. The redemption of Muslim slaves held in Christendom was a pious and meritorious act of Muslims. Some rulers even eschewed ransoms, accepting only the exchange of slaves in treaties with European states. Internationally, negotiated returns of Muslim captives became more common from the Karlowitz Treaty of 1699 in the Balkans, although it proved difficult to oblige private Christian owners to agree to cede their slaves for a fair price. In 1810, a Luso-Algerian treaty led to the return of nearly 100 Muslim slaves held in Portugal as a part payment for Portuguese slaves detained in Algiers. Semi-professional private ransomers emerged, often merchants with Sufi connections. Alms collected in mosques, pious bequests, and the revenues of charitable trusts all served to purchase the freedom of fellow believers. The French Revolution swept away white slavery together with other feudal relics. The French freed slaves in Genoa and taken over the Napoleon Bonaparte famously liberated the 2,000 or so remaining slaves on Malta in 1798. However, it is not so well known that he prudently declared that there should remain prisoners of war to be exchanged for European captives in North Africa. Moreover, he balked at the extending liberation to Egypt. In 1814 and 15, the Congress of Vienna took a decision in principle to put an end to all slavery in the Mediterranean. Did the Ottoman delegation abstain? This helped to justify the British refusal to return to Malta to the Knights of St. John. Some Europeans nevertheless tried to turn the clock back, and it was not until 1888 that Pope Leo VIII unequivocally condemned the peculiar institution. All right. So we read a lot. We covered a lot of ground. This book covers a lot of ground. Again, this is the Cambridge World History of Slavery from 1420 to 1804. And what we just read about the European slavery is very complex. We read about Russians being enslaved, Frenchmen being enslaved, English, Irish being sold to Ireland, Australia, and so on and so forth. The Cossacks, the people of Malta, the people of Turkey, the Ottomans. It's very intricate. A lot of this involves white people being enslaved. And again, I wanted to take my time and read this to you guys so you guys can have this material and understand that, again, slavery is not something that is exclusive to people of a darker hue, as we just read in Europe. It was an institution, as we read in the first source that we opened up with, that was always practiced. And other Europeans, Cossacks, Russians, Circassians, Croatians, these people were being enslaved. So white Muslims, we were bringing up that. Jews, these people were being Poles, people from Poland, these people were being sold as slaves, being captured, forced into the galley slaves if they do convict labor, their children being kidnapped. So this was going on. It was very prevalent. We get numbers of about 500,000 in certain countries and polities of these white slaves, 9,000 slaves in North Africa in a certain city. So we can see that this was pervasive during this time and it was prevalent. Let's continue to read on. White servitude in the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman conquest from the late 14th century flooded the heartlands of Islam with a variety of Christian slaves. The collapse of the rump of the Byzantine Empire in 1453, followed by the Christian states in the Balkans, yielded huge numbers of captives, augmented by the daring raids well beyond the limits of Muslim conquest. The Balkan frontier began to stabilize from the end of the 16th century, giving rise to a shifting border zone, which continued to be a source of slaves, albeit on a smaller scale, unfortunately. No historian has attempted to quantify these flows, although some kind of rough estimates should be possible from existing documents. Supplies from the Black Sea appear to have been larger. Muslim Tartar raiders, especially those settled in the Crimea and loose vassalates to Istanbul, harvested the Christian steppes and forests with ruthless efficiency, sacking Moscow outside the Kremlin walls in 1571. A compilation of partial statistics and patchy estimates indicates the Crimean Tartars seized a little fewer than 2 million Russians, Ukrainians, and Poles from 1468 to 1694. The Crimean Tartars seized fewer than 2 million Russians, Ukrainians, and Poles. That's a lot of slaves. Additional slaves from the Caucasus, especially Circassia, were channeled through the Crimea and were obtained by a mixture of raiding and trading. Spotty 16th and 17th century customs statistics suggest that the Istanbul slave imports from the Black Sea may have totaled 2.5 million from 1450 to 1700. In addition, there was an overland trade into Anatolia from the Caucasus. So you had slaves from the Caucasus. Again, more lightly complected people being enslaved. That's the point. I'm driving this home at this point. So the conversion to Persia to heretical Shia Muslims from the early 16th century opened up a third external source of white slaves. for the Ottomans. As bad Muslims, the inhabitants of the Safavid Empire were fair game, even if some ulama continued to express scruples about enslaving schematics. Such doubts were overcome by declaring the Shia Persians in Assyria to be apostates, which was punishable by death and the forfeiture of their dependents. An Ottoman-Persian treaty of 1736 declared an end of the practice of mutual enslavement by Sunni and Shia armies, with the Persian negotiators pressing most strongly for this innovation. However, Kurdish raiders under loose Ottoman serenity long continued to enslave Shia believers as well as Yazidi syncretists. Raiding and warfare were supplemented by levies on empire's own population, most infamously in the form of Devrishmi, a tribute in Balkan and Anatolian Christian youth. This flouted Sharia prescriptions on the treatment of peaceful, conquered Dahimi people of the book, provoking bitter laments in Balkan folk songs. The system would wound down during the first half of the 17th century, officially netted around 200,000 youths between 1400 and 1650, and many more unofficially. Not only Christians, but also Jews might still be lawfully enslaved if they broke their pact with Muslim rulers, which entailed the payment of heavy additional taxes and subjection to sumptuary and other discriminatory legislation. This loophole was at time manipulated by unscrupulous or the fanatical. Ottoman sources of slave strength in the 18th century, albeit not to the extent that has sometimes been asserted. The second unsuccessful assault of Vienna in 1683 was probably the last occasion on which Ottomans took substantial numbers of captives from Christian foes, allegedly some 80,000 in all. Subsequently, the Austrians pushed southeast, insisting on the mutual release of prisoners of war. The Russians curtailed Crimean raiding after 1694 pressed ever further south and seized the Crimean Peninsula itself in 1783. However, Christian rebellions within the Ottoman empires continued to yield slaves, with the last large haul obtained by suppressing a Greek uprising for independence on the island of Chios in 1822. Moreover, Polish deserters preferred enslavement to being sent back to the Czar's army. The Sublime Porte also compensated by drawing increasing numbers of white slaves from the densely populated Caucasus. Chechen and Dagestani and Kurdish Muslims frequently raided their Armenian, Georgian, and Ossetinian Christian neighbors. They also raided Muslims of a different sectarian orientation from their own, as the Caucasus was riven with disputes between petty Sunni and Shiites. Many captives were sold to the Ottomans. Furthermore, Christian elites in the Caucasus provided slaves as a tribute to the Sublime Porte, or simply sold their enemies and serfs to Muslim dealers. The Circassians of the northwestern Caucasus provided particularly a larger number of slaves, despite nominally passing from Christianity to Islam in the course of the 18th century and becoming Ottoman vassals. Circassians not only sold some of their numerous slaves, whom they encouraged to breed, but also reduced free compatriots into slavery in terms of harsh local customary law. The Circassian trade lasted till 1909, with a brief interruption in the early 1850s. Wow. High rates of manumission were a redeeming factor of Ottoman slavery in the Balkans and Anatolia, where white slaves were concentrated. Although the evidence comes from the 19th century, it is reasonable to suppose that the customary laws were similar in the early modern times. Manumission after 9 years was a rule for white slaves, compared to 7 for blacks, who were thought to be less well adjusted to the cold climate. Although this was customary provision, it seems that the Sharia courts enforced it. Moreover, when owners arranged a marriage for their young slaves, it was common to free them at this time. However, these liberal customs were not applied in the Arab provinces of the empire, and a British observer of the 19th century noted that they increased the demand for fresh imports of slaves. This makes it all the more difficult to estimate the size and demographic profile of white slave population in the early modern Ottoman Empire, drawing on war captives for a long period, having access to well-organized slave trade. bias toward female slaves, sex ratios would have been fairly even. Slave procreation was possible and many adults were free, which would have made for a relatively young servile population. Urban numbers were closely large, but there has been a tendency to underestimate the scale of white rural slavery, at least in the Balkans and Anatolia. Parts of this urban bias springs from the historian's fascination with Ottoman elite slavery, both military and civilian. The Ottomans inherited the Islamicate model of military and administrative slavery, but gave it a new twist in the form of the Janissary infantry units that conquered much of southeastern Europe. This probably inspired the smaller servile Spanish speaking military units who operated in the southwest borderlands in North America. In the Ottoman case, Janissaries were relatively privileged men who often owned their own slaves and stood a good chance of being manumitted. However, they were forced to convert to Islam, were circumcised, and were culturally brainwashed to forget their families and cultures of origin. They could not marry, were subjected to brutal discipline, and often found an early grave. The Janissaries were overwhelmingly recruited from Balkan youths levied through the Diversame, although few of these youths went into the elite cavalry units of several or served in the palace. As the Diversame declined in the first half of the 17th century, the Janissaries were gradually transformed into free corps with much relaxed discipline. However, some purchased slave boys from the Caucasus continued to be enrolled as soldiers, and administration was largely staffed by white slaves well into the 19th century. White military slavery loomed even larger in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman empires in the form of perpetuating elites of purchased and converted slaves, typically serving as a cavalry rather than infantry units. These servile cavalrymen were usually purchased from the Caucasus, and the system persisted in Egypt after the Ottomans had defeated the Mamluk state in 1517. Indeed, Circassian Mamluk power revived in the late 17th century because the Ottoman Janissary forces declined in military efficacy, allowing Egypt to become autonomous. When Napoleon seized Egypt in 1798, he boasted that he had overcome the Mamluk army of 10,000 Circassians and Georgians. Mainly Georgian Mamluks also became the de facto rulers of Iraq from the 1740s and 1830s. The harem, a source of endless fascination of early modern European intellectuals, was another center of elite slavery. Few concubines actually shared the ruler's bed. Even if they did, they were denied sexual access to the sultan after they had borne him one son, and were vulnerable to sudden shifts and palace intrigues. Although the early 17th century empire was called the Sultanate of the Women, only one concubine could become the power behind the throne. If her son was the victor in a vicious succession struggle that followed the death of the reigning sultan, many concubines never even reached the sultan's bedchamber, but were denied the possibility of having a family's life, as were the domestics in the small army of female slaves who attended the inhabitants of the harem. As for eunuchs, initially employed as harem guards, but increasingly as trusted officials, they could be of any race, with blacks becoming more common from the 17th century. A handful of eunuchs became truly powerful, but they were as vulnerable to political changes as concubines. Furthermore, the traumatic operation and robust adolescence of their manhood were reported to kill between 15 and 90% of the victims, according to the skill and experience of those who performed the operation. In theory, eunuchs were meant to be purchased only after having been castrated by infidels in the abode of war, but this operation was often performed on slave boys in the abode of Islam. Indeed, in a minority of cases, it was Muslims who wielded the knife. Castration was prohibited in 1715 in Egypt, apparently with little effect. The bulk of white slaves in public employment ended up far less privileged positions, notably toiling in gangs on colossal construction projects. The most dreaded occupation, as in Christian ports, were the punishing and dangerous work of rowing galleys. However, the fear of servile uprisings, stoked by a number of incidents, led to a partial substitution of slaves by conscripted labor, with some free labor as well. Moreover, as sailing ships came to prevail in the Ottoman fleet from around 1700, galley services declined rapidly. Of the urban white slaves in private hands, a fair number worked in proto-industry commerce and domestic service in the main towns of the Balkans and Anatolia. Slave artisans were common, especially in the flourishing textile worship of Bursa, where a fifth to a third of the population around 1500s were servile, where an estimated 6,000 changed hands every year. There were similar concentrations of servile artisans in Istanbul, Edirne, Sofia, and Ankara. This type of work usually entailed liberation after a fixed period or a completion of specified set of tasks, which enhanced productivity and lowered costs of supervision. Other skilled male slaves acted as business agents for their service masters. Freed skilled slaves became clients of their former masters and could look forward to comfortable level of remuneration for their skills. Household drudgery was most common for the urban female slaves, for wealthy individuals copied the harems of the sultans, complete with servile concubines and eunuchs. Ottoman agrarian slavery has been surprisingly little studied, perhaps because it has so frequently been assumed to have been negligible or not even non-existent. In the Arab lands of the empire, rural slaves were likely to be black, but in the Balkans and Anatolia, they were mainly white. There were servile plantations, notably in the vicinity of Istanbul, to satisfy the gargantuan appetites of the immense capital city. Typically on the reclaimed land ceded to the members of the military elite, estates often grew rice or cotton. Furthermore, surviving inheritance registers indicate that there were many holdings of limited size, each employing only a small number of agricultural slaves. Far too little is known about the system of smallholder slavery, which was more generally characteristic of the Islamic Middle East. Descendants of agrarian slaves tended to become free rent-paying tenants, so that white agrarian slavery declined over time until an influx of Circassians settlers in the mid 19th century injected new life into the system. The intimate details of the lives of the white slaves in the Ottoman Empire are hardly known, with the significant exception of some of the great concubines and eunuchs. Even then, there's a lack of personal narratives of those subjected to servitude. Similarly, the history of resistance of slavery has hardly begun to be written. There are no signs of any major rebellions, but many indices of slaves employing the weapons of the weak. For military slaves, the Bektashi Sufi order, suspected of Christian and Shia deviations, provided an institutional haven. All right, so we're getting through this. You know what I'm saying? We pro-literacy here. We're going to read here. So the next segment that we will be dealing with will be the white servitude in Iran, Afghanistan, and Turkestan. Some takeaways from the chapter we just read, or the segment of the chapter we just read. As we can see, white slavery was prevalent amongst the Ottomans. Circassians, we just read about Caucasians being enslaved, Muslims enslaving other Muslims that they deem to be fake Muslims or from another sect. So as we can see that the history of slavery is very intricate and complex. It is not solely based on one thing or one element as skin color. Moving on, Iran, Afghanistan, and Turkestan. After the new Safavid dynasty had made Shiism the religion of the Iranian Empire in the dawn of the 16th century, Persians and Azeris were enslaved by the Ottoman Sunni adversaries, as noted earlier. More dangerous than the Ottomans, however, were the Sunni Turks from Inner Asia, where the Uzbek Khans are ferocious nomadic Turkmen tribes centered around the southeastern Caspian Sea. According to one estimate, 1 million Persians had been taken as slaves to the West Turkestanian by the 19th century. Sunni Muslims of the Caucasus also raided the Shia slaves, especially in Ashabad. In addition, Pashto and Baluchi raiders from the east believed to be the meritorious to enslave Shia opponents, including Hazara Mongols of central Afghanistan. However, customs of manumission were quite generous among the Sunni, often after 10 years of the Uzbek areas. Iranian armies retaliated by taking Sunni and other heretics as slaves, so that the net flow, depending on the balance of power at any given time. The Ottoman-Persian Treaty of 1736 may have restrained Iranian captures of the Kurds and Turks, but it did not apply to Sunni enemies to the north and east. Moreover, Ibn Karhi heretics were enslaved when Persia intervened in the Omani Civil War from the 1720s to the 1740s. However, Iranians were generally prepared to free Muslim slaves who converted to their Twelver brand of Islam, and Shia law strongly recommended the freeing of all slaves after 7 years. Moreover, Shia law insisted that slavery by birth was conditional on both parents being slaves. White Christian slaves from the Caucasus were also numerous in Iran. The Safavid army reputedly brought back 30,000 people from the Caucasus in 1533 to 1534, Georgians, Circassians, and Armenians. Similarly, a Qajar force allegedly captured 15,000 Georgians after taking Tiflis in 1795. Most Caucasus slaves were probably obtained through tributary and commercial relations similar to those prevailing in relations with the Ottomans. That said, Christian Armenians came to have special protected status in Iran once Shah Abbas, 1587-1629, had settled large numbers of them as free subjects close to his capital in Isfahan. Other white infidels supplied slaves to Iran and Turkestan. Russians were frequently the victims of endemic violence that pitted Christian Cossacks against the Turkic Muslims and Mongol Buddhists of the steppes. Sold on the settled areas farther south, Russian captives were more numerous in Turkestanian than Iran, giving rise to the correspondence between Russian Tsars and Uzbek Khans in the 17th century. Pashto raiders in Afghanistan took most of their slaves from the Amanist unbelievers of the Kafiristan northeast of Kabul. Only forcible Islamicized under the name of Nuristan in the late 19th century. As for the Zoroastrian slaves noted in Turkestan, they may have come from either Persia or India. South Asians formed a significant segment of the early modern servile population in Iran and Turkestan. Mughal armies seized numerous Hindus and Jains from the frontier areas of rebellious communities and exchanged them for inner Asian horses, vital for survival for Muslim rule in India. Thus, the Persians supposedly swapped horses for as many as 200,000 Indian rebels in 1619-20. Indian slaves, numerous up to early 18th century decline of the Mughals, should perhaps be counted among the area's white slaves, as notion of white and non-white are hard to establish in this area. To add the complexity of the situation, black African slaves were imported through the Persian Gulf, while small numbers of Chinese slaves appeared in East Turkestan. In occupational terms, many white slaves of the Safavids were employed in relatively privileged positions as concubines, Mamluks, and officials. Whether castrated or not, however, Christian slaves from the Caucasus may have been significant in the relatively intensive agriculture of Azerbaijan. Reliance on servile soldiers and officials rose sharply in Iran under Shah Abbas I, who broke with the millenarian and tribal roots of the Safavid dynasty. Under the successor Shah Safi, 1629-42, concubines replaced princesses as the mothers of the rulers of Ottoman lines, and hereditary families of elite administrative slaves emerged, unlike the Ottoman case. There were estimated to be 1,000 military slaves and 3,000 eunuchs serving the Shah and as in Isfahan alone. Sarutaki, an Azeri eunuch, originally castrated as a punishment for homosexuality, a violation of Sharia, wielded great power as a Grand Vizier from 1634 to 1645. Over time, superficially converted Georgians came to dominate the military slave corps in Iran, as they did in Iraq. Turkestan relied little on military and administrative slaves, but employed particularly large numbers in productive tasks, even if the ethnic divisions of labor remains far from clear. As with Indians, some Russian captives were valued for their proto-industrial skills in the cities, which contributed to a great reluctance on the part of the Uzbek Khans to grant them freedom. However, other Russians were unskilled agricultural laborers. Persian Shia captives worked in increasing numbers as herders in Turkestan and on the grain and cotton estates of the oasis, especially as supplies by Indian slaves contracted sharply in the 18th century. By the 1810s, Persians were reported to be the chief agrarian laborers and the Uzbek Khanites. All right, moving on from that, I believe this is the final segment, white servitudes in the Maghreb. So white servitude in the Maghreb. It says, although the regencies of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli were technically under Ottoman suzerainty, the Sublime Porte exercised very little real authority in this area. With the Barbary corsairs increasingly making and breaking their own international agreements, in the far west, Morocco was never part of the Ottoman Empire and was unique in having direct access to the Atlantic. However, the Moroccan corsairs of Saleh and the Rif again enjoyed a high level of de facto autonomy for much of this period, where corsairs were less influential. Maghrebi slavery depended more on blacks transported across the Sahara, such as those who played an important role as Mamluks in the Moroccan army for much of this period. Thus, it was noted that the troubles in the Barbary were greater than ever on account of the natives' hatred to the black standing army kept up by the new emperor, whose insolences were become so insupportable that the country was in general up in arms against them. It says white captives in the Maghreb were overwhelmingly taking in native raids as the Mediterranean and North Atlantic formed a maritime border zone between Islam and Christianity. Barbary corsairs initially launched devastating attacks on communities dwelling along the western Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts of Europe. Spain, Portugal, and France, and Italy bore the brunt of these attacks, which netted thousands of captives at a time well into the 17th century. Occasional raids on the coast of the Ireland, Wales, and English Channel, and even distant Iceland supplemented these Mediterranean sources, especially in the early 17th century, when the corsairs of Saleh and Morocco took to Swear Ridge sailing vessels. Direct sieges of Europeans living in the coastal communities became less significant from the second half of the 17th century, especially in distant lands, but such raids, long persistent in areas close to the Maghreb, southern Italy, and eastern Spain, were the main victims, together with the islands of the western Mediterranean. As late as the 1798, Barbary corsairs took 900 slaves from a small island off southern Sardinia. Indeed, they exploited the disorders of the Napoleonic Wars to step up land raids on Mediterranean shores. Moreover, as the Maghrebi gradually whittled down the number of Iberian coastal enclaves from the late 17th century, they placed defeated Christian settlers under the yoke. In a strange reversal of fortunes, even French slave traders operating along the Senegal River of West Africa were at times seized and marched north across the Sahara. Captures at sea from as far as the great European fishing fleets on the Newfoundland banks compensated for reduced numbers taken on the land. The amount of shipping leaving European ports in the Atlantic and Mediterranean expanded dramatically in the 17th century, with 6,000 to 10,000 merchant vessels a year, each vessel carrying perhaps 15 men sailing within easy range of Barbary corsairs. Among such vessels were some on their way to West Africa to purchase slaves. Ships wrecked on the North African coast yielded an additional, albeit much smaller, quota of captives, allowing Berber communal villagers access to white slaves. The peak of white slavery in the Islamic Western Mediterranean was probably reached around 1700. Over time, European nations signed treaties to protect their shipping, providing their vessels with duty and certified passes. Indeed, the registers for these passes form an impressive and so far little exploited set of records for European shipping. Governments, ports, communities, and religious institutions also made growing efforts to redeem captives, although the later development created a greater incentive for Muslims to capture Christians for ransom or exchange. The pass system generally reduced the supply of new captives, albeit in return for protection money that allowed for the fitting out of raiding vessels. It was only from the late 18th century that Europeans and North Americans took more drastic action to curtail white slavery in the Maghreb. The Portuguese and English blockaded the Straits of Gibraltar for a long period of time as the Napoleonic wars dragged to a close in Europe, Western newspapers called vociferously for naval action to liberate the Christian slaves of Maghrebi corsairs. The Congress of Vienna in 1814-15 solemnly pledged to put an end to Muslim slave raiding and slavery. The carrot was the Muslim merchant ships were allowed to ply their trade peacefully, and the stick took the form of naval expeditions. Anglo-Dutch and Anglo-French naval forces attacked Barbary ports in 1816 and 1819, respectively, and the United States forcibly imposed a treaty on Algiers in 1815. The French seizure of Algiers in 1830 ended a process of cajoling, intimidating, or battering the Barbary states into freeing their Christian slaves. Relations between Christians and Muslims were more savage than in the Eastern Mediterranean, where the Ottoman Empire was part of the consort of Europe. A French fleet sailed into Algiers in the late 17th century and began an indiscriminate bombardment of the city. In return, the regent threatened to use the French accredited agent who was attempting to negotiate the release of captives as a cannonball, and did so when the bombardment continued. The French responded by slaughtering 30 Algerian galley slaves on board. They quartered their corpses, tied the body part of the wooden boards, and by the waves floated them towards the town. This behavior was influenced by the perception of the inhabitants of Barbary strongholds as common pirates rather than the duly licensed privateers that they claimed to be. The frequently expressed opinion that Barbary corsairs were in a state of permanent jihad, holy war against Christian powers, is at best a partial truth. However, it was contested by some ulama, for no caliph declared a jihad, and rapine was all too clearly the main motive for piratical forays. The voluminous literature on Barbary slavery yields some assessment as to the scale of these captures and the slave population that they supported. Although the records do not match what is available for the Americas, the wealthy were ransomed. Even the poor could be redeemed by charitable bodies, but numbers returning to Europe were small overall. According to Robert Davis' careful calculations, 1 million to 1.25 million Christian captives entered the Maghreb from 1530 to 1780. Of these unfortunates, it is estimated that fewer than 5% escaped or were ransomed. From 1520 to 1830, Algiers alone imported about 625,000 indeed. Algiers struck newcomers as distinctly Europeans in appearance, just as Kingston in Japan was described, in Jamaica was described as looking quite African. Attrition rates for white slaves were estimated at 20% a year in 17th century Maghreb, and this meant that large inflows of newcomers were necessary to sustain the existing servile population. Given the age of captives seized from European sailing ships, the hostile epidemiological environment of the North Africa, and harsh working and living conditions, the crude mortality rate among whites was probably higher than among blacks in the Americas, even on sugar plantations. As long as captives were primarily taken in raids on land in the 16th century, there would have been a fairly normal population pyramid. For the sea patches that followed capture was relatively short. The number of white females among captives no doubt accounts for the whiteness of the population of the city of Algiers that contemporaries noted. From the mid, and this is huge right here, because I believe after this part here, it's going to discuss how they were mixing with these white women. So I'm gonna read this again. I hope this didn't fly over nobody's head. The numbers of white females among captives no doubt accounts for the whiteness of the population of the city of Algiers that contemporaries noted. From the mid-17th century, the sex ratio of white captives came to be overwhelmingly male, even if a few female passengers were taken from ships, and some women were still seized on land. One estimate suggests that well more than 90% of the white captive populations of the Maghreb after 1650 were men. White captives in North Africa were thus at the opposite end of the demographic spectrum from Russian slaves. This pattern coexisted with black slave trade across the Sahara, in which the majority of the victims were women, so that sexual relations between white and black slaves in the Maghreb blurred the boundaries between the two kinds of servitude. Maole Ismail, Sultan of Morocco, deliberately mated white males with black females. Similarly, an entrepreneur outside of Algiers sold mulatto children resulting from forced couplings between black women and European captives. Conversely, the Basha even ordered the blacks to ravish the women prisoners in presence of their husbands, but the women resisted, preferring death to the embraces of the Negroes. One estimate suggests that half of Barbary captives between 1580 and 1680 were of European origin. And Ottoman observed in the early 18th century that these renegados are neither Christians, Muslims, nor Jews. They have no faith nor religion at all. The cosmopolitan elites of the Barbary ports even included the odd Japanese and Chinese adventurer. Renegade Christians often maintain close links with their areas of origin and might negotiate a further turning of their coats with the Inquisition or the Knights. Whatever the nominal fate, they live by the usanza del mar, Mediterranean lore predating any world religion. Contrary to stubbornly held stereotypes, many of these renegados, perhaps the majority, were free Christians and Jews rather than manumitted slaves. Infidels were discouraged from converting to Islam when there were galleys to be rowed, as a custom held that Muslim slaves should not perform this harsh task. Even when such constraints faded, converts were mainly skilled artisans and soldiers, nubile women, and male concubines of homosexual corsairs. Moreover, Maghrebi Muslims strictly adhered to Islamic orthodoxy and refusing to accept conversion as a passport to freedom. Numbers of white slaves who both converted and were manumitted thus remained very low, typically restricted to concubines who bore children to their masters. Together with a few privileged and trusted men, this was a far cry from the relatively liberal customary law of freedom prevailing in Anatolia. The numerous captive accounts written from the 17th century to the early 19th century, not one of which can be authenticated as written by a woman, reveal extremely harsh conditions compared by Robert Davis to Soviet gulags. Food was scarce and bad, work on construction sites and galleys was exhausting, and discipline was severe. 16th century corsairs brandished slaves in violation of the Sharia, and prolonged beatings on the soles of their feet were the unusual punishment for slaves. An Amsterdam newspaper reported in 1728 that Christian slaves were employed to seal off streets infected by the plague. The treatment probably improved slightly in the 18th century as ransoming became more significant. The asset value of captives increased, providing an incentive for better treatment. Furthermore, Christian groups established permanent hospitals and agencies to minister to various religions and national segments of the white slave population. When Mulay Abdallah overcame rival claimants to the throne of Morocco in 1730, one of his first edicts allowed the Spanish fathers of the redemption of the captives to establish a hospital. He gave them free and protected access to his dominions. White captives with only a slim chance of escape, ransoming, or manumission could be driven to rebellion, especially when they had rising expectations. In Algiers in 1763, 4,000 Christian slaves rose and killed their guards and massacred all that came in their ways. And all the gates of their towns were shut. A general massacre was apprehended, but after some hours of carnage, during which the streets ran with blood, quiet was restored. All right, so we're almost finished. We just covered slavery in the Maghreb. It deals with when I made my song, the introduction song about the Barbary slave coast, the Corsairs, do the naval raids to the Mediterranean, Gibraltar, a lot of that increased commerce and traffic in these areas in the Atlantic. The people of the Maghreb, like the Barbary states, the Berbers, they took advantage of that and they were enslaving a lot of these white Europeans to the effect that they started mixing with these white Europeans. And that may be why we see a lot of lighter skin tones in these regions. That could be why. And that's what the author of this segment pointed out. That may be why. Let me see if I can find that real quick. That quote. right here, the number of white females among captives no doubt accounts for the whiteness of the population of the city of Algiers that contemporaries noted. so, so white slavery was so prevalent in these areas during these times that it even affected the phenotype of these areas. Now we're going to get to the conclusion: contrasting styles of servitude. Although whereas adherents of Islam and Christianity recognized the civilized status of their opponents, incorporation as slaves occurred whenever the opportunity presented itself. For religion made the other a quintessential outsider. However, the power of Islam and Christendom was balanced enough in the old world to prevent either from gaining very large numbers of captives. Moreover, the difficulty of finding in the other culture a cooperative agent hindered the passage of Europeans into Islamic slavery through trade in limited numbers moving the other way. By the time that Islam began to lose significant ground in the late 18th century, Europeans had found satisfactory alternative sources of slaves for an increasingly racialized system in their American colonies. In any case, some Westerners were beginning to view all kinds of slave trade and slavery as immoral. Like the Republicans, the Whig Party, they were the promulgators of liberty. The Republicans were formed to stop the spread of slavery. We covered that in a video before. Whig Party as well, the abolitionists, yada, yada, yada. Y'all know. If you've been following the channel, y'all should know. Let me keep reading. It says Christianity and Islam both erected ideological barriers against enslaving those who would share religious beliefs, which further depressed sources of white slaves, although concepts of heresy allowed the significant breaches of such norms. Western Europeans continued to seize and enslave Orthodox believers in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially if they could show that the captives have collaborated with the Muslim overlords. In Islam, apostasy was a catch-all concept that justified the enslavement of a wide variety of bad Muslims well into the 12th century. Both Muslims and Christianity saw animists as immediately eligible for enslavement, whereas Jews were caught in an uneasy intermediate status. Some 13th century Catholic theologians asserted that Jews were enslavable as the collective murderers of Christ, but this view was not always shared. Catholics placed some Jews in limited servitude in the 16th century and truly enslaved others, especially collaborators with Muslims. Similarly, Jews were theoretically protected from enslavement by the Sharia, but only as long as they were not judged to have broken their pact with Muslims. As for captive whites taken into the American or African Aboriginal societies, they were initially outsiders, with enslavement as a potential institutional device to convert them into insiders. In the terms of closed and open forms of slavery, the British and Dutch ran some of the most closed systems the world has ever known in the Americas, making any escape from servitude extremely hard. Paradoxically, however, they put an effective end to servitude in Northwestern Europe itself. The ultimate act of openness in the Catholic and Islamic world, slavery was hardly questioned, but rates of manumission were high and conversion might entail freedom. Social integration over time between generations were encouraged by institutions such as religious brotherhood and clientage. In short, Catholic and Islamic slavery combined hard labor and high attrition rates with the possibility of the reduction of social marginality over time. The racialization of slavery correlating strongly with closed systems was an anomaly in the long history of servitude, for slaves had traditionally come from any and every human group. And this is why I wanted y'all to get out of this. As we go through the summation and summary of this, this racialization of slavery is a new phenomenon in the world. It came later, started to bubble and formulate in medieval Christendom, and then it evolved in the Americas and to blow up into black equals slave, or slave proper means black people, but that wasn't always the case. That's a new phenomenon. And as we can see here, slaves had traditionally come from any and every human group. And this is why I named this white slavery, so we can cover this vast period of time when we had Europeans, Caucasians, Sardinians, Croatians, the people of Cossack, Russians being enslaved and sold, for religious reasons or, convict reasons, wars, and so on and so forth. The Barbary slave coast, we covered that. Let's keep going. It says the racialization of slavery developed most strongly in the colonies of northwestern Europe. Contradictory attitudes towards race and slavery were highlighted by cases of crews of British slave ships seized by the Maghrebi Muslims, with the last known case occurring in 1796. Petitions from home ports seeking the release of these seamen demanded British government action in the name of Christian charity and humanity. Similarly, Robinson Crusoe could spend time as a Guinea trader and then 2 years as a captive of a Turkish rover without his creators showing a hint of irony of his situation. For 18th century Britons, eligibility for enslavement and the identities that supported it meant that there was no irony. Not until the abolitionist era did observers compare the norms of intergroup behavior within Europe with the norms that govern relationships between Europe and non-Europeans. This was tantamount to saying that nobody should be eligible for enslavement, and abolition was, in a sense, merely the widening of the definition of eligibility for insider status. Catholic areas witnessed a slower, more incomplete, and more uneven racialization of slavery. As late as 1773, the Marquis of Pombal fulminated against metropolitan Portuguese cohabiting with slave women of every color. The French went further down the racial road than the Iberians and Italians, erecting the most explicit distinction between black slaves in the Americas and white slaves in Europe. Nevertheless, the fact that there were white slaves in France set the country off from England and the Netherlands. Moreover, the Catholic Church exerted a powerful influence on rates of manumission, creating a large black and mixed race population as a buffer between slaves and masters in the New World. In the Islamic case, the racialization of slavery was even less developed, although Bernard Lewis argues that the common colloquial Arabic term for slave, abad, gradually came to be coterminous with black, meaning the same, by the 19th century. However, the three consonants that are the roots of the word abad carry the principal meaning of worship. The Arabic legal term for slavery is arik, literally the yoke, the root consonants of which were never employed to denote any human group or other than slaves. The traditional inherited from Ibn Sina was that both extremely fair and extremely dark people were naturally servile. Slaves in Islam continued to come from all the major races of humankind into the 20th century, even including Arabs, and they were all mixed up together. In addition, slaves of any color could reach the highest posts in society as a military and administrative slaves or as concubines and eunuchs. All this made it particularly hard to racialize the institution. Indeed, even early modern white servitude in itself forms a major counterweight to exaggerated views of racialization of slavery. The rise of an oppressive second serfdom in Eastern Europe, together with the tenacious persistence of white chattel slavery in the Islamic Middle East and Catholic Europe, accounted for millions of individuals in all. There may have been fewer convicts, destitute children, and indentured servants, and even fewer white chattel slaves in indigenous American and sub-Saharan African societies, but they all added to the variety and geographical scope of white servitude experiences. It is abundantly clear that servitude in the Western Hemisphere was in no sense an exclusively black preserve in the early modern era. It is abundantly clear that servitude in the Western Hemisphere was in no sense an exclusively black preserve in the early modern era. And that is white servitude. Again, this book is the Cambridge World History of Slavery, Volume 3. That's what we read tonight. And I hope you guys got something from that summation and the reading and the material that was brought out today. I'm going to try to go through these comments, and I'm hoping that you guys are able to digest this material. Let me see. I'm not going to be on here too long. Let's see. Shalom to my brother Labanaya. Shalom, Damon Williams. Damon Williams. Shalom. Shalom to my brother Sean Yap. What's cracking? We in the building. TV to ET says, LOL, Moors are Amorites and they come from haplogroup E. Moors are black and white. The house of Canaan was cursed with leprosy and Ham's wife probably had some DNA in them. I don't know about that, but yeah, I do agree that some Moors were haplogroup E and they come in both black and white variations. Answer that. He said, yellow, this is not pertaining to the topic today of white slavery, but I guess he pointed out because I pointed out Irish people being sold as slaves to places like Australia. He said, are some Irish Israelites? It is possible that some Irish could be Israelites. Shalom to Ramal Yahoo. Shalom to my brother Ruth Smith. Yap in the building. Let's see. Shalom to my brother Al Qaim in the building. Shalom. Let's see. Ajaya says, you're not completely understanding the text. I would love to explain it. Ajaya Maccabees, if you're referring to Deuteronomy 28:68, I understand the Israelite circles meat rash of that scripture and how they try to say that is completely 100%, concrete evidence that a certain group of people are Israelites. And I disagree. Because as today we point out, a lot of people were sold as chattel slaves. Some sold over ships, sold, via ships. And that doesn't automatically make someone an Israelite. You need more evidence than that. That's all I'm saying. T Dizzle says, don't worry about the other channels. Keep doing your thing. I always do that. I never worry about the white noise. Appreciate it, though. Shout out to Elkheim, number 8, grade A, uncut truth on his channel. School of Skills is bringing up scriptures. Shalom, the School of Skills. Shalom, Lashari. Sister Shari in the building. Shalom. Let's see. Effortless says, I am a descendant of a Huguenot, which still makes me fit Deuteronomy 28 LL. I mean, you might be an Israelite. I don't know your ancestry, so I can't speak on it. Clash of Session says, are we talking about the Barbary slave trade? The part that was dealing with the white slaves in the Maghreb brought up the Barbary slave trade. My brother Mike for real says that is why in reading prophecy we have to be honest about world history. Slavery did. We realize plenty of European slaves can trace back their roots while our history and roots are hidden. Okay. Mike Real also states we talking about the history of slavery, including all people moved via slavery, regardless of ethnicity and religion. Exactly. Slavery is not just preserved to people with a darker hue. If you didn't get anything from this, at least get that and glean that a little bit. Ruth Smith says, was our history hidden on the internet? Hello, maybe if you didn't have the access to a library. My brother Ruth going in. Mike for real response says, hidden in the sense it was not, though commonly in our institutions, just because something is hidden, it does not mean it cannot be found, as you said, hidden in plain sight. Okay. He says, having access to the library but not knowing which books displaying our full experience and culture feels hidden to me. Many books rewritten, and excluding vital information to find our Israelites. I don't know what these brothers they speaking in English. I don't know, but shout out to y'all. Subscribe to the channel, like and subscribe, and share the video. Thank you. Little Prince117 says, any take on the Slavs in terms of who they are biblically and genetically? Not sure if you covered it already. Apologies. If so, no, I have not covered that. There hasn't been a place of interest for me studying wise. So I haven't looked into that, who the Slavs will be genetically or biblically. Little Prince 117 is also on the subject Israelite Irish. Check out the book From Whence Came the Black Irish, written by the same guy that wrote Hebrews of West Africa. Yeah, I don't doubt that some of them could be Israelites. I don't doubt. I just have to, dig deeper in that. I got a book called When Scotland Was Jewish that dives in that, and some of them had haplogroup E. So definitely some Shemites were there. All right, I'm getting ready to close this thing out, man. Yap Gang in the building. I know we rocking, man. Like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. All the material. Before I get out of here, let me read this. All the material that was read today covered under fair use, which states that Section 107 of the Copyright Act provides us a statutory framework for determining whether something is a fair use and identifies certain types of uses such as criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. And I believe we did a little bit of all of that. We gave our commentary, we gave our criticisms, we did this for teaching purposes and scholarship and research purposes. So we are covered under the Fair Use Act. All right. With that, I'm going to say shalom. We're going to get out of here. I appreciate everybody that came through. And, shout out to people that are pro-literacy. I support pro-literacy. I push pro-literacy on my channel. Read a damn book, man. Peace.
Jedi. Righteous. What you know about the Barbary slave coast? Let's get it, let's get it. Let's get it, let's get it. Let's get it, let's get it. Barbary. Straight from Algiers. Morocco. Pirating with my peers. Barbary. You should have known not to mess with the West African jewelry. The fascists can't fool me. Your cargo set aflame again. Terror of the Mediterranean. You don't know who terrain you in. Your people in chains again. The tide gon' change again. And yet we'll reign again. We are the crosshairs. You are in our crosshairs. If you gon' get caught here, you have to beware. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. Barbary slave coast side. Barbary slave coast. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. Barbary slave coast side. Barbary slave coast. Warriors of the Maghreb. Whipping on your back ribs. For your foul practice. Bodies in the water, no Baptists. Now we got power over all. Remember Hannibal. No matter how big, how tall. Even Rome had to fall. That's right. Remember Queen Kahina. Barbary jewelry distinguished. The polity king us. Magi the arena. When we set sail, make the pale people well. Moors bring terror to where you dwell. Come in, take this L. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. Barbary slave coast side. Barbary slave coast. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. Barbary slave coast side. Barbary slave coast. Who I gotta come murk for some commerce. The open sea be a hearse. It's time to usurp. The British don't wanna see us. Didn't wanna free us. Now we moving white. Like a what? Like a cocaine dealer. Get into these shackles. Get into these boats. Right. Either that or be ghosts. Black Caesar. Sent to Turkey, no hope. That's right. My ancestors feeling me, living out antiquity. When black people rule the sea, Barbary, no man can fool me. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. Barbary, slave coast side. Barbary, slave coast. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. I'm on a boat looking for white folks' side. Barbary, slave coast side. Barbary, slave coast. Real pirates of Caribbean, blood of a North African. Hebrews and we trafficking. Hebrews and we trafficking. Real pirates of Caribbean, blood of a North African. Hebrews and we trafficking. Hebrews and we trafficking.